everybody. Welcome to another episode of Digital Diary. I am so happy to be here with my colleagues today, and we are going to talk about some ways to use a pattern in a unique way. Sometimes we just look at patterns and say, well, that's a log cabin pattern, or that's a forward patch pattern. And I think one of the best things about pattern management is we see our patterns more. They're in front of us, we see them. And you know what? Sometimes we see a quilt and we think, oh my gosh, I remember that pattern and it wasn't designed for this, but I think it would work. So I'm going to start everybody off. And the pattern I used in a couple of quilts is called Greek key. And it's a really simple pattern that I got when I first got my machine. So let me do a screen share real quick here. And I want you to see what I did. So I took that simple pattern, Greek key, and this is certainly not a Greek key quilt, but what I did is shrink it down so that it perfectly fit each little corner of the pinwheel. And so you still see that motion and you don't necessarily think about it. I think the border was only like 4 inches. So that meant each 6-inch Greek key went down to 2 inches. But I think it totally works in this quilt.
I have a question for you, Georgia.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you put that in as a border, or are those individual blocks?
I did it as a border and I shrunk them down. So, and as long as you get the right size, you pretty much, it's going to fit. So I didn't come in and draw all the little blocks and then fit it in. I did it in as a border. And on the bottom, what you're looking at is 2 borders, right? Because one border is 2 inches and then the next border is 2 inches to give you the whole 4 inches. So it worked pretty well. And it wasn't that hard. I mean, it may look complicated. The customer thought maybe it was, but it wasn't at all. And then taking the exact same one, I kept trying to think of a background that was fairly simple for these little kimono girls. And I don't know why, because there's nothing oriental about it, but it was Greek key. But look what, and it was simple and easy to do, not a ton of tie-offs, and it was fantastic. I thought it turned out really well. Certainly, Greek key isn't the first thing in your mind when you're thinking about a background for kimono girls, but it totally worked. And next up, how about Christine? Let's see what Christine has.
So this is my swoon quilt. It's a pattern by Thimbleberries, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Big, giant blocks. So these blocks are like 24 inches, something like that. And what I wanted to emphasize when I was quilting this is not only the block itself and kind of that circular wreath look around the block, that carpenter star area, but I also wanted to make sure when I quilted it that I had a pattern that fit relatively well in that negative space in between those blocks. Mm-hmm. And so what I did is I did a little bit of quilt math, because, you know, occasionally we do these things. And so I wanted that circular pattern. So I used this wreath design, which, you know, is not necessarily something that you would look to go to, right, but it provides a circular element to all the square blocky bits. I thought it complemented the kind of wreath surround of those carpenter stars.
Sorry, what I really like about this, Christine, is you see similar elements in the same negative space.
Exactly.
So it looks so planned out.
It does.
Yeah. I have a question. Did you leave the open areas open to allow those, what are they, rhombus shapes to come up?
It's just in the pattern that way, but yeah. The biggest part here is that I was able to size the pattern so that I could get not only the center of one of those circle wreath patterns on top of every star, because there's one of those wreaths on top of the actual center star in each pattern, but I also have one in the center of that negative space area, that rhomboid thing. And the best part with this pattern is it came in half wreaths, and so it came in a semicircular thing. And so literally I could go as long as they were all laid out properly, I could go and stitch out a whole row of them, and as long as they were laid out at the right interval, the pattern itself would just fit the piecing underneath.
So it looks a lot harder than it really is.
It looks a lot harder than it actually is.
Did you add the center circles into the pattern, or add them
Yes.
after you quilted the first?
I added them after. There was no way to insert it into the design and keep it continuous. So the wreath parts are, I could stitch out a whole entire row, and then I had to go back and put those little center things and the little double wedding ring bits.
I love this one. This is a great use of those wreaths. I have those patterns. I don't think I've used them until now.
This is one of my favorites, and I love how it turned out. And you have that, you show the same elements again over the top of different areas of the piecing, and it looks completely different. Yeah, this is kind of my semi-custom, where I have it, for the most part, it's a lot of edge to edge overall kind of patterning, but I've made sure that it hits the piecings well.
And what I love is it makes other people guess at how did you make that happen. They're just like looking at it because they're thinking, well, I have that pattern, I think, and I just love using patterns in unique ways.
And like I said, the main part with this was figuring out the sizing so that I could have those patterns hit exactly where I wanted them to.
Right. Looks
fill
awesome.
in the outer areas.
Phil.
Great.
Phil's my friend.
Yeah.
I love Phil.
Me too.
Just went off the edge.
Okay, well, let's see who's up next. The next quilt is Deanne's.
This quilt, I really liked the ombre fabric in the border, and I wanted to showcase that because you really weren't going to be able to see much in the center. It was part of a panel. So the outside, the borders, those are point-to-point triangles. Cool. And I just had one set on the inside and one set on the outside. And it just turned out really spectacular. And then on the inside of the quilt, I took a pattern that wasn't an edge to edge, so it wasn't all nicely squared up. And with nodes, adjusted it so that it would fit inside and not have to use fill, because I didn't want very much overstitching. It was going to show a lot. So, but since you can't really see, just plain leaves in the center was, I don't know, made it fast and easy.
Yeah, and that's what we like, isn't it? I think it looks fantastic. Anytime, I love the arches in a border. I think they look just so special.
And I like the curved cross hatching.
Yeah, it looks great.
It just
all right.
focuses everything toward the center, like a good
Yep,
frame.
moves your eye. Moves your eye.
Okay, next up we have Gina.
This quilt I did a few years ago, and I couldn't figure out for the life of me what to do in the center, but I wanted to showcase it a little bit. So I did a medallion, kind of like what Christine did. I put a giant medallion in there just to kind of showcase that area, because you weren't going to be able to, I didn't want to do geometric triangles and squares in there. I wanted it to have some roundness to it. So I chose the wreath to put in the middle. And then I put a border around the wreath just because that space, this was a few years ago, and the wreath came whole, and I wanted to put something around it. So I put a border around it to fill that square area, and then another sashing around it in the beige area there. And then I couldn't think of what to do on the outer edge. And the trees kind of spoke to me. I got going with the little willow trees at the beginning and just decided I was going to hand drive the outside. So for this one, I combined the computerized quilting and hand driving.
Well, it looks fantastic. And it adds some life. You have so many straight lines with all the buildings that having that wreath in the center just makes it so much more interesting. And it's not always the first thing you think about when you think about filling that square, but it makes it very unique.
Yeah, it works. Keeps your eye moving in a circle.
Mm-hmm.
I always like curvy designs on lots of straight edges and straight designs on lots of curvy edges because it makes one look more like the other.
Right, right.
And it just makes it plain more interesting, doesn't it? Well, that's a gorgeous quilt. All right, next up we have Paige, and this is the quilt.
Now, this is a very traditional Baptist fan, and it's a pattern that came on my Statler. It's the middle row, and I wanted to change it up a bit, so I used the pattern and made some changes. So in the first picture, you can see that I am just using, and I am using repeat patterns, and I put all the patterns in, and then I alternated. So I had an extra pattern on every row, and it was offset. And then I selected every repeat in every other row, and I flipped it horizontally. They still don't exactly line up, so then you have to nudge them over. And at the end, you get Baptist fan with a twist. So I used a very traditional pattern with a little bit of twist on it, and it really adds some motion to quilts. Very easy to do, and it runs just like an overall design because it is one.
So do you go over one way and back the next?
Yep, when you're flipping that row horizontally, if two of those rows were to fit in the bed of my machine, I could do a fill on 2 rows and it would stitch continuously over and back. This I've done where I've taken this design very, very small. And it really adds a nice interest. I mean, I can go 1.5 inches between those rays or the bars on the fan down to the smallest I've done was 3/8 of an inch. It was pretty cool. And I think this would make a great background, Georgia, like what you did.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking in the back of my mind going, oh, this is one I have to remember. And I think size is very much, sometimes maybe it isn't that the pattern isn't what you would think of, but sometimes just totally resizing it gives you a whole different look. And
oh, absolutely. Better.
Yeah, I really like the idea of just changing the size of something. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to have a unique pattern. Maybe you just change the size to an unexpected size. And I love pattern management just because your patterns are in front of you. You see them more often. And when something unique comes up, maybe you're able to recall a pattern that you wouldn't have thought of. I one time had a large butterfly and I realized the body of the butterfly was the shape of an ice cream cone. And guess what? I had just gotten a pattern for an ice cream cone border. And sure enough, I looked up that pattern, plopped it in, perfect. Yeah, I couldn't have picked a better pattern. And it certainly wasn't designed for a butterfly body, but it worked. So I hope everybody's enjoyed this discussion about unique pattern choices. And we certainly have enjoyed our time with you. And we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of The Digital Diary, Adventures of a Computerized Quilter. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.